given how raw our country is right now, I'd like to offer this poem called Risk by Anais Nin. And then the day came when the risk to remain tight in a bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. What I love about this poem is in a single sentence, it serves as an understated call to action to make change now, even though it's very scary. So I am the director of the International Arts and Mind Lab, and I'm also the co-director of the NeuroArts Blueprint and the co-author of Your Brain on Art. And in my role at the IM Lab, we are very focused on amplifying human potential through the arts and aesthetic experiences. And it's through this lens that we look at four different distinct pillars. The first is research, where we're looking at basic and translational research, dissemination and scaling, with an eye to really honoring the whole person and thinking more deeply about a systems approach. The second area is in field building, and I'm very proud that we have been part of the work that's been done with impact thinking and creating a model to study the arts in a very generative way, and also in launching the NeuroArts Blueprint. And finally, in beginning to think very deeply with scholars and practitioners and many other policymakers around intentional spaces. We also see ourselves as a community builder, and finally are very interested in creating academic pathways to use this knowledge in multiple ways, from educational programming, publishing, conferences, and meetings. So the field that we work in is called neuroaesthetics. And while philosophers and artists, and I think children, have known the power of the arts, it's only been in the last 30 years that we've been able to non-invasively get inside our heads to study the extraordinary ways that the arts and aesthetic experiences, including architecture and design, change us. Data science and AI are now enhancing this ability. So the official definition of neuroaesthetics is the study of how the arts and aesthetic experiences measurably change our brains, body, and behavior, and how this knowledge can be translated into practices that advance our physical health and mental health, well-being, learning, public health, and communities. So by design, this is a highly translational discipline. And neuroaesthetics is happening at the intersection of the arts and health and science, and it's also really engaging technology. It brings together basic science and the social sciences to create a highly interdisciplinary field. And at the heart of this is rigorous research, and that's research in all of the ways that we think about knowledge and evidence building. So it's a very exciting time where we're seeing both the science and the arts coming together to really make huge impacts on the way that we can use this work to amplify humanity. Neuroarts is the emerging field where neuroaesthetics is the science, and we are literally seeing a new field coming into being before our very eyes. Part of that work really evolves around what we mean by knowledge making. And so when you think about the arts and aesthetic experiences, we could never reduce this work to a single cell or a single biological system. And we need a new framework. So one of the things we've been talking a lot about in our lab and in the NeuroArts Blueprint is something called ways of knowing. And as you know, there are many ways of knowing. In this grid, you'll see we talk about ancestral knowledge. We also are looking at lived experience. What are those things that we bring to a conversation throughout our lives? Also looking at artistic practice, and that's the range of artistic practices from creative writing, visual arts, movement, to thinking more deeply about the way design, industrial design, architecture, landscape design, and so many other ways of creative expression. And then the last is academic knowledge. How do we really think about that? And it's through this lens that neuroarts is truly what I like to call solution science. So last year in November, the lab created something called intentional spaces. And we had the opportunity to bring together interior designers, architects, commercial builders, policymakers, researchers, all interested in the potential of intentional spaces to really attract and think more deeply about the kinds of problems that we're trying to solve for through places and spaces. And these can be physical spaces, but also virtual spaces. And as I think about intentional spaces, or some people might call it neuroarchitecture, I think of this as a subfield of neuroarts. So the Intentional Spaces Initiative really aims to expand the foundations for collaboration between scientific research and design practitioners. And we have created approaches and frameworks that we think will help be able to bridge some of the gaps between the sciences and the arts that can result in more impactful spaces. And in order to really create these kinds of new frameworks, we asked the folks at this gathering to think with us more deeply about these questions. And so, what do you see as the most promising in this intersection of built environment and well-being? What are the key challenges? What does effective collaboration between research and designers really look like? And so many more questions that I think begin to start to address this question of this conversation today, which is, what are some of the blind spots that we really need to be looking at? And when we met with over 300 practitioners and researchers and other stakeholders, what we saw was that there were so many opportunities to really open this up. Coming away from that event last November, we were able to analyze 10 different core themes that came from these conversations and from the data that we were able to code and better understand. And they include developing a framework, really lifting up the awareness of this work, communications between all of the different stakeholders, understanding the methodologies and measurements that are available to understand evidence and impact and even mechanisms, but also thinking really innovatively about what are some of the ways that we might create new methodologies and new ways to understand. Thinking more deeply about access. Who's at the table? Who isn't at the table? How does this become part of an equity lens and a diversity lens? And then also looking at the implicit need for interdisciplinary relationships in research and practice, and to make sure that all interested parties are at the table. And then what does it mean if you're doing interdisciplinary work? What is an effective collaboration, with an eye to thinking about how do we create the future, what those challenges and blind spots are, and then looking at how do you implement the recommendations that can be really important for the field at large, no matter what perch you really sit at. So just a couple of key takeaways. It's very preliminary, but the data appears to be pointing towards 5 high-level takeaways for the field. The first is developing rigorous research and evidence. The second is cultivating awareness and really thinking about how we communicate this work to advance health, well-being, learning, community development, and all the other ways in which this space work can be used. Really undertaking intentional interdisciplinary collaborations, and then developing a set of effective and usable kinds of methods and measurements that can be used in context for solving different kinds of issues around space. And then the last is prioritizing equity, inclusion, and participation for all human-centered practices around this from the outset. So in closing, I want to thank you for your time, and I want to share my blind spot question for discussion. How can we open our minds and hearts to different ways of knowing, to design transformation spaces for humanity? Thank you.